In this episode, we will take a brief look at the XCO Libraries. If you want to see the full version, you should check out the ABAPConf 2025 recording. We will give a brief introduction to the topic and then look at the libraries in detail. You will find further links to the video in the description. XCO stands for Extension Components and describes a collection of libraries for using various functions in the system. In the past, there were different functions modules for different functions, such as converting from string to X string, which had different interfaces and perhaps also functioned differently. The goal of XCO is to standardize interfaces to one or a maximum of two objects that perform similar or identical functions. In this overview, we will take a look at where you can find the XCO libraries. On the left, you can see the SAP S/4HANA Cloud system, but this could also be an on-prem system. On the right, you will find the side-by-side extensibility. The XCO library is therefore available as a local sub-API or side-by-side in the ABAP environment, where it contains the most current version. If you look at the objects, you will initially be confused, as there are a very large number of XCO classes, interfaces and objects. Therefore, here's a brief overview of 3 actual versions that exist. The first version is Standard ABAP, but also called Classic ABAP. In this example, we see an overview of the XCO class. This contains numerous APIs and is therefore the largest class in terms of functionality. The class contains numerous attributes and methods, each defined as static. The second class is XCO CP. As the name suggests, it is primarily available in the cloud platform, meaning it is ABAP Cloud ready. The first noticeable difference is that there are 2 fewer methods. In this case, the integer object and T100 dyn message is missing. Objects with this name should also have a C1 release contract. The third version is for key user apps, or KU for short. As you can see, additional attributes and methods are missing here. The key user classes are therefore primarily released for key user extensibility and cannot be used in ABAP Cloud. Classes beginning with XCO are therefore important in all 3 cases. If you want to get an overview in the ABAP development tools, you can create a new ABAP repository tree. To do this, we define the object pattern according to the XCO star and set the type to class. If we then sort all classes by API status, we will see all libraries for the corresponding language version at the end and have a good first introduction. How do we use the XCO libraries? Here is a first example. In this case, we create a string object using the XCO CP class and pass our test string to the method. In this case, we receive a string object back. The various methods of the class are essentially factory methods, meaning the methods return a new object. In the next case, we can then directly call other methods of the object, thus creating a chain of calls. This is the fluent interface pattern. We can now call additional methods such as append to append another substring. Finally, we call split, but instead of receiving a string object, we receive a strings object, a table of different strings. If we then want to access the contents of the object, we usually use the value attribute, which in this case returns a string table. Here is the complete statement again without the XCO component. Our result would be in the split variable at the end. It's a little bit complicated, however, if we are looking for a specific format option, for example. In this example, we want to format a date and are looking for an appropriate format for the date. Since we have the interface information here, we can find the corresponding types using the type hierarchy. For example, let's look at the type for the ABAP format. Unfortunately, it is set to create private and there's no public attribute to create this format. However, we see a global friend with the corresponding factory, which means we will take a look at the factory in the next step. This is also set to create private, but again has a global friend. So we navigate to the next class. In XCO CP time, we find a public attribute called format. If we look further down in the class constructor, we see that the factory is created accordingly when the object is called. So we've finally found the appropriate class. We can then create an instance using the format attribute and find the ABAP format for formatting and output. What about catching exceptions? In most cases, the framework already handles catching exceptions and wraps them in no-check exceptions. For example, if you remember to use the UUID, we usually have to catch the exceptions if we want to create a new UUID. However, since an error when generating the ID is very rare, we avoid catching the exception and thus have a shorter call. If an exception were to occur, it would be triggered and cause our program to crash, which in this case would also prevent more serious errors. But what about the libraries? What different libraries are there? Most developers who think of XCO will first think of object generation. However, there is also an information system with which you can obtain further information about classes and other objects, such as the content of methods or specific definitions. There is also a specific class runner. Unlike the classic version, this can, for example, catch exceptions and easily output various XCO objects. There is also a specific Excel component. This can read and create Excel files, and the last version already has various formatting options. Overall, however, the Excel component is not as comprehensive as, for example, the open source project ABAPXLSX. There is also a library for formatting JSON and a library for accessing various system informations, such as the current date or the call stack. As already mentioned, there is also a library for generating UUIDs, for handling strings and X strings, and for processing messages. However, this is only a rough overview of the various libraries. There are many more libraries to explore. You can find a link to a more extensive overview in the video description. This was a rough overview of the XCO libraries and how you can use them effectively in your everyday work. Finally, we want to summarize that the XCO libraries are difficult to learn at the first, especially if you come from a classic development background. Understanding the different types of formatting and relationships requires familiarizing yourself with the libraries. One advantage of the XCO libraries is that they are available across all platforms regardless of whether it is a cloud edition or on-prem. One open request for SAP is to expand the libraries and provide missing functions. For example, there isn't an information object for all object types to better analyze the types and objects. Furthermore, the JSON library, for example, has problems converting Boolean types. Therefore, my advice to you is to try out the new libraries and use them in your everyday life. I hope you learned something from it, and see you next time.